Hello and welcome to the Sky News Daily. I'm Tom Cheshire, and for the last 5 days, I've been looking at the Israel-Hamas conflict in my role as Sky News' data and forensics correspondent, seeing what light satellite imagery, data, social media can shed on the situation. Today, we're going to be looking at some of that, but also speaking to our people on the ground there, as well as the wider picture as America's Secretary of State arrives in the country. We're also going to take a look at another story reported in the Times, that criminals convicted of some of the most serious crimes, including rape, could temporarily avoid going to jail next week as prisons are too full to house them. But first, America's most senior diplomat, Antony Blinken, is in Israel to affirm US support after the brutal attacks by Hamas and as Israel prepares for an assault on Gaza.
Israel has the right, indeed the obligation, to defend itself and to ensure that this never happens again. As the Prime Minister and I discussed, how Israel does this matters. We democracies distinguish ourselves from terrorists by striving for a different standard, even when it's difficult, and holding ourselves to account when we fall short.
It's his first step on the tour of the Middle East as the US tries to stop the conflict spreading. Sky's international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn has spent the last week on the Israel-Gaza border, and he joins us now from Jerusalem. Dominic, let's start by talking about Antony Blinken, his arrival today. We'll talk about the wider diplomatic picture. But, it seems like it's almost unconditional support. There is an aircraft carrier parked, in the Mediterranean Sea as a show of that support. But he also talked about upholding the rules of international law. And he said that Israel has the right to respond, but how Israel does this matters. Is that the US urging restraint?
I think not at this stage. I think it will do so as the days unfold and possibly the weeks unfold, because we don't know how long the ground operation the Israelis are going to be launching is going to go on for. At the moment, it's pretty much unqualified support, following the pattern that we normally see with these flares up of violence over Gaza, although we're expecting this to be of a different order. And what normally happens is the Americans fully support the Israelis, and then as the Israelis go in very hard into Gaza, using attacks from the air and then on the ground, and as civilian casualties mount and numbers of women and children die, then the Americans start putting more pressure on, less so than European countries, but that's normally the pattern. But I think what the Americans are worried about at the moment is less the impact on the civilians of Gaza and more on the implications for regional stability and the possibility of this expanding into a much bigger conflict. There is a genuine fear that what Hamas has begun, Israel's other big enemy in the north, a more formidable enemy, Hezbollah, the Shiite resistance organization, as it calls itself, in southern Lebanon, very much backed by Iran, could get involved. I think the fear is that Hezbollah is part of the plan, or may see an opportunity Israel get drawn into Gaza and gets into trouble there in a military sense. And don't forget, their Hamas enemies have proved themselves to be much more capable fighters in terms of strategy and the use of surprise and infantry tactics than we've ever seen them use before. So if the Israelis get into difficulty in Gaza, Hezbollah might see an opportunity to do what they've always wanted to do, which is attack Israel and effectively wipe it off the face of the earth. And Hezbollah has a lot more missiles, 10 times more missiles than it had in 2006, the last major conflict with Hezbollah. So I think the big fear for America and other countries as well, of course, is that Hezbollah does get drawn in, and that's why America has sent so many of its naval assets to the east of the Mediterranean to kind of ward off Hezbollah and also their Iranian patrons, but also I think to get involved possibly in hostage rescue operations, because we know a number of Americans are being held in Hamas as well as other nationals.
You've been there since day one. Before we even knew there were hostages, it was just an attack. Just give us a sense of what it was like, and also the mood of the country, Israel's own understanding of what it suffered.
I think really there has overwhelmingly been one of shock and of deep worry and concern, because they know they live in a neighborhood where weakness is dangerous. And Israel has always projected strength, has always been able to control and manage Gaza in ways that are very controversial, but they've kept the Palestinian threat in Gaza at bay. And also they have a power of deterrence after 2006 that has stopped Hezbollah doing anything on the northern border. And I think their concern is that this sort of mystique of invincibility that the Israeli military has always projected has been massively undermined by what has happened. I mean, the videos that Hamas have been putting out of their fighters going out on motorbikes surrounding Israeli military bases, not just the kibbutzes, but also Israeli military bases, getting into them and then slaughtering Israeli soldiers in their beds. The videos of Israeli soldiers carrying and begging for mercy, and of Israeli soldiers shot and killed and executed. They're profoundly shocking to Israelis, but also very, very worrying, because they have totally got rid of that, so dispelled that sense of invincibility for the Israelis. And that is very dangerous in this part of the world. And I think that's why Netanyahu and his new emergency war cabinet are under such enormous pressure now to take revenge, to retaliate, but also try and restore that sense of deterrence. And of course, the loss of Israeli deterrence is dangerous regionally, because it might encourage others to have a go at Israel. And of course, that is leading to these fears of regional instability, which is another reason why the Americans are getting so actively involved.
You've been speaking to people on the ground, families of victims. Is that something that the population is feeling in a visceral way too?
What they say to you is that two things. One is that we've been hearing this from officials as well, which is that the time for postmortems is much further down the line. This is an emergency. They've got to get that border secure, and they've got to neutralize the threat from Hamas. But what they say most of all is that this kind of process, or that they've seen in the past, a kind of cycle of Hamas attacking Israel going in eventually in a, you probably hear the siren there, Tom, but I'm going to have to move back into the corridor. The windows are shaking, so I'll have to come back to you in a bit.
Oh yeah, get to cover, thank you. Dominic's back with us now after taking cover. Is everything okay?
Yeah, all fine. Yeah, there was a siren and then an explosion. I think it was the Iron Dome going off. There was an explosion in the air, and when that happens, the windows shake. So that's slightly sort of thought I better sort of get away from the window.
Dominic, just to pick up on that point you were making about Israel feeling safe.
The Israelis call it mowing the grass, which is a euphemism for basically cutting Palestinian threats and Hamas down to size periodically, so that Hamas gets to the point where it's firing too many rockets. The Israelis go in, they use airstrikes, and they neutralize the threat, and they kind of degrade Hamas to the point where it's less of a threat. A few years later, it comes back again. And what the Israelis are saying to us, all of them, what we've said to us, is that this can't go on, that it has to be dealt with now once and for all, and effectively the grass has to be uprooted more than just mown. And that is a huge challenge for the Israeli military, because that means going in and not just sort of going in for a week or two, but going in on the ground and either staying in there indefinitely, possibly reoccupying Gaza, but certainly going into the point where they can control territory and making it impossible for Hamas to keep firing rockets.
You've been down there on the border, seeing the troop build-up, but also speaking to victims, families of victims on the ground.
We went to the town of Sarat looking for victims of Hamas, those who've been rocketed, but also those who were attacked on that terrible day. And what we found wasn't what we expected on one street. We were told by their neighbours that in this one house, there were Arabs living there, and Arabs from Gaza, which wasn't what you expect in Sarat, which is an Israeli town, as I say, just outside Gaza, which does not have Israeli Arabs or Arabs of any other sort in it, because they live in different parts of Israel. 2 million Israeli Arabs, but they don't live in Sarat. We knocked on the door, and a very frightened-looking man did let us in. The Tanaburas are a family been living in this town for 35 years. Their father moved there because he had worked for the Israeli state, not sure in what capacity, and he had 6 sons. On the day of the attack, one of them went for a walk to go and buy some cigarettes. And his brother Yunus told us what happened next. He said that he went to buy cigarettes. He saw an injured man lying on the floor, covered in blood, and tried to help him. He thought that man had been injured by a rocket, but actually didn't realize that there were terrorists in the town, as they called them. And he was then killed by those Hamas fighters. So the brothers didn't know what had happened. They waited, and he never came back. Eventually, they were sent a video that a friend had seen on TikTok showing their dead brother's body. Amir was, his body was in a car, and he was dead. I asked them what kind of a man Amir was. They said that he had a heart of gold, and as they say, God takes only the best. And then what they said about what should happen next was surprising, because they are from Gaza, they are Arab Muslims, but they sympathize entirely on the Israeli side of the argument because they've lived in Israel all their life. And what they said to us about what should happen to Gaza and Hamas is something that you hear, and that sounds pretty extreme, but you hear it from almost everybody you speak to here. The way they put it was that they are murderers, that they are terrorists, Hamas, and that Israel should erase everybody, they say. Gaza should be flattened. And they said, we have family in Gaza, but we still think Gaza should be flattened because Hamas is such a threat to Israel, but to the rest of the world.
Dominic Waghorn there. Thank you very much for joining us, and do stay safe. It is a constantly changing situation, of course, so for the latest on the conflict, you can follow our live blog on the Sky News website and on the app, and there is, of course, full coverage on the TV channel. In a moment, we'll turn our focus to reports that convicted criminals could temporarily remain free as there's no room in prisons. Now, we've known for some time that prisons in England and Wales are seriously overcrowded. But it looks like it's got to the point where they're too full even for convicted criminals to be sent there to serve their sentences, at least temporarily. But to examine how we got to that point, we'll speak to former prison governor Vanessa Frake-Harris. But first, Sky News home editor Jason Farrell is here with us. Jason, this story, it sounds like people who are supposed to be going to prison may not be going to prison, people who should be kept in prison being released early. What exactly is this plan and why is it happening?
So Lord Justice Eases, who's the most senior judge in the land, is basically saying to other judges, delay your sentencing hearings for certain crimes. It's not uncommon for a sentencing hearing to be delayed. So someone is convicted of a crime and then you might wait a month or so whilst there are certain things done to see whether there are mitigating or aggravating factors or psychological reports, those kind of things, before they come back and decide what the sentence is. Or there might be a delay because there's not room in the courts or whatever. And what the suggestion here is that might happen with quite serious offences such as rape. And a particular judge is quoted in the Times saying, you know, what am I supposed to do? Release someone back into the community if they're convicted of rape on bail. Now, of course, they can have bail conditions. And I think actually that's another problem here, that bail conditions aren't always kept to and rigorously policed. And I think there's concerns around that. But yeah, the idea of a rapist being convicted, so knowing that they're going to go to prison, and then perhaps being free to intimidate the person who's accused them. And we're not quite clear as well how long these sentencing delays are going to be, and I don't think the judges are quite clear either.
They said it was a short-term measure, but
yeah,
they have a habit of becoming longer-term.
Exactly. And the problem with this is, and you asked how has this come about, the problem is because of the prison population. So the capacity we have is roughly 88,000 plus, 88,600, and capacity is just below that at the moment, and by next month it will be above it by 400 plus places according to predictions. And that's a real problem because there's only so many things you can do. You can either slow down the rate in which you put people into prison, or you speed up the rate in which you take people out, and that's then a political decision. And that's not something the government would not want to be looking to do because they're looking to be tough on crime. Or you find other spaces. So it might be police prison cells, it might be magistrate cells. That's certainly been happening. And the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, was talking about possibly renting prison space in other European countries as a solution to this. It's definitely a problem.
We've known there's going to be an increase, even if there have been things like the COVID backlog in courts and maybe speeding up through this. Why hasn't that planning been there, given we knew what the number was going to be 5 years ago?
The government would say, well, the planning has been there. We've been building the prisons. We've been increasing the capacity. They say their first priority is to keep the public safe from dangerous criminals. And that's why they've ended the automatic halfway release for serious sexual and violent criminals. But they say the criminal justice system has seen unprecedented growth in the prison population. You mentioned the pandemic, because there's a massive backlog. I think it's around 65,000 cases now that they're trying to push through the courses and having weekend court dates and things like that. So that means more convictions. They've recruited more police officers, which would mean more convictions as well. And they say the prison service has already put in place measures such as rapid deployment cells, doubling up in cells to help manage these pressures. And the government's carrying out the biggest prison building campaign since the Victorian era. They say to build 20,000 new places. The opposition say, well, actually, they haven't done that yet. They say they would get on and do it. But they also say that what they need to do is actually increase the number of Crown prosecutors to get these criminals behind bars as well. You can see it, can't you? There's huge backlogs that get caught in different places, and the backlog is basically now arriving in the prisons and will continue to do so. So that the projection is, I think, in a couple of years, 94,000 people, when they've still only got, say, they're obviously trying to increase on that 88,000 plus spaces, but it doesn't look like they're going to be able to create it. Other problem is they're not able to recruit the staff quickly enough.
It sounds like it's the short-term fix for what you describe is the very long-term problem. I'm joined now by Vanessa Frake-Harris, who's a former prisoner governor, former head of security and operations at Wormwood Scrubs, and the author of a memoir called The Governor. We're in a situation where we're going to have convicted criminals not going to jail. We've got other convicted criminals finishing their sentences early. That's extraordinary.
Literally, we're running out of beds. And what usually happens is we use police cells, but of course that costs money per prisoner place. It's not an unusual thing. It's been happening for years and years and years.
When it is overcrowded, when there's overspilled. You just paint a picture of what sort of pressure that puts on the prison system.
If you take Wandsworth Prison, it was designed to hold 960 odd prisoners. It's actually got closer to 1,600 prisoners in it. So you've got prisoners in cells designed for one person that have got maybe 2 or 3 prisoners in it. This causes frustration. It can cause violence, especially if you've got like low staffing figures. Trying to run any sort of regime with that many prisoners is very, very difficult and takes a lot of organisation. And of course, what it does affect is our re-offending rates, because you're so much concentrating on giving prisoners the basics, i.e. a shower, exercise and serving them food, that actually you don't concentrate on what's really important, is about addressing their offending behaviour. So this has a real knock-on effect. I think every week I find myself, talking about prisons in one form or another. And I think it's time that the government stopped, had a look at our whole justice system and did something about it.
How have we got to this situation where capacity is so stretched?
I think, there's been a lack of serious investment in new prisons over the years. We tend to use the prison system as a vote winner in this country. So it's very easy for us to rally round and say, let's lock them all up and not do anything.
You're someone who's worked at the front line of this, been in the thick of it, and you're saying actually lock them up doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. I think you only need to look at the reoffending rates in this country, compared to the rest of Europe. You have to ask yourself is why are we one of the countries in Europe which locks up the most prisoners? Why is that? Are we sort of telling our judges to teach them a lesson because, they've stolen a British rail sandwich or a bottle of whiskey from Tesco's? That doesn't work. Giving somebody a sentence of 3 months or 6 months when they only do half of that sentence is tantamount to pointless.
In terms of those fixes, lots of fixes being made all the time. I think some of that is because I think we've had 10 justice secretaries since 2010, 12 prison ministers. How hard does that make it to take that look at the whole system, to make that long-term plan?
Well, look, it's incredibly hard. Like you say, 12, 13 prison ministers since 2010. You just feel like you're on a roundabout because every single prison minister that comes in all say a different thing. So you just get used to working one way, then it's all change and you change again. They all think that they've reinvented the wheel when actually they haven't, because what they have said you now have to do, you did 5 years ago, it didn't work then and it doesn't work now. So these are all things that have stretched and made demands on an uninvested service.
Let's talk about the quick fixes that are either being put in action at the moment or the government are proposing. This idea of renting prison space overseas. How feasible is that, sending our prisoners abroad?
Really, are we going to send our problem for somebody else to sort? And has anybody thought of the cost for this, the cost for the taxpayer in sending our prisoners over to the Netherlands? Who has thought of the cost of all of this? Instead of actually trying to work through the problems that the prison service is in they're coming up with pie in the sky. Why not send them all to Rwanda? Why not send them all to Australia? We've done that before. You know, it just borders on the ridiculous to me.
I mean, just in terms of, I mean, you mentioned the problem of investment and how there's not enough money. Let's say that money was there, but is there anything that needs to be done in terms of sort of wider reform other than just sort of increasing funding? Is there anything that actually needs to change in the system that you think would improve things?
I think we need to look at the types of prisoners that we're jailing. And I think we need to look at those prisoners who are in prison who shouldn't be in prison, prisoners with mental health issues, you know, prisoners, foreign national prisoners, of which there are many, and the time that it takes to deport them. You know, all these types of prisoners who actually shouldn't be there and who are blocking up beds. That's the prisoners that we should be looking at to free beds.
That's it for today's Sky News Daily. See you next time.